What is Gregorian chant? Video 4. Today we discuss how chant was handed down over the centuries, how it fell into disuse, and how it has experienced a revival in the last 2 centuries. In the first video, we discussed how Gregorian chant notation first emerged around the year 900, while the texts of the propers and ordinaries existed beforehand for an unknown period of time. There are actually several different systems of notation that exist simultaneously in Europe. Here are a few examples. This is from St. Gall, which I believe is in Switzerland. It's kind of hard to see here, but there are some squiggly lines, some curvy lines, and some points. So, that's one example. This is Laon notation, which I believe is French. Similar but different. These curvy lines are much taller squiggly lines. Still has points. Whereas the St. Gall was a little bit less elaborate in its squiggliness. Here's another example. This is Breton notation. Again, pretty similar in a lot of ways, but some more differences. See, this curve is a little bit, the slope is a little bit more gradual. And this one in particular seems to have a lot more points in it. Each system of notation had different system of what we would call points today. Some of them were like this, where they kind of looked like they had little tails. And other ones, they look like lines. I don't have any of this memorized, but this is just stuff I know anecdotally. And here's another example from a totally different part of Europe. Beneventan notation, which is Italian. As you can see, this is actually quite different. Very, very tall squiggly lines. Not curvy at all, really. Just squiggly. It's also a little bit later because it has a line, a staff. So we'll get to that later. And here's a chart of comparisons. I believe this may come from the great chant scholar Kenneth Levy. This is how we would write it in a chant book today, a scholarly chant book today. It's French square notation, which is what we use when we're reading chant books now. So this is what you would find in a scholarly article, a book, or journal by a musicologist. This is what you would find in a chant book produced by the church today. And these are all various ancient notations from 900 or later. They mean the same thing, they have the same names, but they're drawn differently. These early systems of notation had no staff, no line to indicate the difference in pitch between notes. Thus, it is impossible to tell objectively the flow of the pitches in the melody. Really, there are only indications of note to note whether to go up or down. Scholars have long assumed that these systems were meant to jog people's memory, but the singers knew the melodies by heart, and such a system of notation wasn't meant for sight singing, but as a memory aid. Here's another example. This is called the Graduale triplex, which was produced in the 20th century by the monks of Salem. We'll get to them in a minute. What's interesting about this is it presents the later French square notation, which again is what we use most of these days, but it also uses, I believe this is St. Gall up here and Leon down here, or maybe it's the other way around, notation to the early other systems of notation. Saint Chant shows how they're notated differently in those two different forms of notation, and also gives you an idea of how the monks would go to these ancient sources and compare them to come up with a modern edition, which again we will get to in a minute. These systems gave a lot of information on rhythm and expression, even though they didn't have a staff. For example, in a lot of these early systems, one can find the letter T over notes, such as right there, which stands for tenere, the Latin word for hold. Thus, this we assume meant to elongate a note. We can also find C, which stands for Latin celeriter, or celeriter, Latin for quickly. And there's a lot more of those. And these in particular, I believe, were prominent in St. Gall notation. As the centuries pressed on, chant singers recognized the need for a system which better indicated how pitches relate to one another. A single staff emerged, just one line, which helped indicate the live pitches, which we saw with Beneventine notation. Then Guido d'Arezzo came along. He is credited with inventing the 4-line staff, which gave very clear indications of pitches, as well as a system of solfege, do, re, mi, etc., etc. Although he called it ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, ut, was the original version. And this is the clef, which eventually would become the C clef, which is used for chant notation. It's been used in chant notation for the last 1,000 years, which indicates where do lies. So that's what you see in a chant. You see a clef. It's called a C clef. Guido's system was important because it seems that by his time, the role of memory in learning and singing the chants had faded. So both an aural, A-U-A-R-L, and a visual system was needed to retain the melodies. Further, more and more chants were emerging, especially hymns of the divine office and sequences, which did not exist back in 900, so they needed to be written down. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, the system of notation had changed quite a bit. The Noms of early chant notation were replaced with square notes, especially in France. I don't know whether or not it continued to exist in other parts, but definitely in France, which ultimately became the hub of chant scholarship. Square notes predominated. These give very clear indication of pitches, of how to go up and down. However, the rhythmic and expressive nuances of early chant notation disappeared for the most part. We don't know the extent to which singers of this late medieval period, roughly the 14th through 16th centuries, were aware of or preserved these nuances in their singing, but the lack of these signs affected the singing of chant later. By the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the Renaissance, Gregorian chant started to fade in favor of the new style of music, polyphony, meaning many voices. This first emerged as an embellishment of chant called organum. Someone or a group would sing the cantus firmus, which was an extremely long, drawn-out chant melody, and over the top of it, other singers would sing elaborate ornamentations. Here's an example. This is the chant melody from the Gradual of St. Stephen. So pay attention to the beginning in particular. Sederunt principes et adversum loquebantur et iniqui persecuti sunt me. That's how it begins. And this is what the organum master Perotin did with that chant. Still only the first syllable of the chant. Finally, the second syllable. Death. So, on that, we went through an entire couple of minutes of that piece, and he had only just taken the chant, and he had only taken sa, da, those two first syllables, and basically gone for an entire minute with each of those syllables, with embellishments over the top of it. Over time, organum morphed into polyphony, meaning rather than one chant melody with embellishments, many voices would sing different things in harmony with one another, but as independent melodies. One of the earliest examples of this is Guillaume de Machaut from the 1300s. And this is a very early example of that, written by Machaut. It's the first polyphonic mass by one composer. Anyway, the polyphonic mass became a hot new trend in music, rather than singing the mass ordinary to a unison chant melody. In the late Middle Ages, it also became trendy to set a polyphonic ordinary to a popular tune, rather than to anything sacred. What a scandal! Around the time of the Reformation, CounterReformation, and Council of Trent, the 1500s, the Church cracked down on music, attempting to make sure that it was not excessive or based on anything secular. Polyphony became much more restrained, and composers tried to base their works on existing chants in many cases. For example, Palestrina wrote the Missa Regina Caeli based on the chant melody for the Regina Caeli Marian antiphon, which we heard in another presentation. Here's the Kyrie again. If you listen carefully, you can hear the Regina Caeli melody. The Church itself put Gregorian chant in danger with the publication of the Medici and Gradual in 1614. This was a book with a whole cycle of propers, but with extremely modified and simplified melodies. Notice it's using square notation. From the end of the Renaissance until the 1870s, the assumption is that Gregorian chant basically died. I'm going to challenge that assumption somewhat. What did die, essentially, was the singing of the ancient proper melodies, replaced either by the Medici and Gradual or by extremely simplified psalm tone settings. However, the popular hymns of the divine office remained, even finding their way into Mass. Also, the more popular chant settings of the Mass ordinary remained in use, as they are much simpler and easier to pull off than the complex polyphonic settings. These were especially popular in mission lands, where they were promulgated by Jesuit and Franciscan priests. In particular, the Missa de Angelis was known around the world, and Mass 18, the simplest setting, Sanctus, etc., remained in use largely due to its association with funerals. When chant was in use between the 1500s and 1800s, however, the style was modified. The Medici and Gradual, with its shorter melodies and square notes, was not sung expressively or quickly like the early Noms indicated. Rather, the notes were all sung of equal value and extremely slowly. Maybe this is where the long-standing association of chant with dreary dirges comes from. Chant was always in competition with two different things. One, popular music genres, and two, simple music. Popular genres always drew the ire of popes and clerics. For example, both Pius IX, late 1800s, and Pius X, early 1900s, railed against how the Mass ordinary settings of their day were largely based on the schmaltzy Italian opera of their day. Simple music was also much more popular than chant. In particular, in America, chant never really had any history, largely due to the huge Catholic population of Irish immigrants. The Irish were long accustomed to having quick, quiet masses, because making any joyful noise in Ireland would draw the unwanted attention of the English, who had long persecuted them. So in America, it became the custom not to sing the Mass, but rather to sing at Mass, if to sing at all. The origin of the four-hymn sandwich, at least for the Catholicism that we know so well, can be traced to the singing of simple Irish and sometimes French melodies and folk tunes as hymns during Mass. Further, American churches, again due to their working-class immigrant populations, could hardly ever afford to pay singers to pull off an elaborate polyphonic setting by Palestrina or Berg. A new day dawned during the late 1800s, really beginning in the 1870s, and maybe a little before then too, but really kicking off in the 1870s. The Benedictine monastery of Salem in France took a keen interest in recovering authentic Gregorian chant. By themselves, they invented both modern chant scholarship and the revival of singing chant in the church. They poured through all the chant books they could find, made notes, and eventually generated scholarly editions of chants, complete with their own new system of chant notation. Salem notation combined the staff and the square notes of late medieval notation with their own version of some of the vestiges of early notation, the rhythmic and expressive markings that disappeared later. For example, see if I can find it. There's a, can't really see it here, it's a little blurry, but that's the quilisma, squiggly quilisma. The diamonds as well. I don't think there are any virgas in here. And then this little line underneath, which might be considered sort of like the T, the tenere. They even threw in some of their own interpretations. In fact, I've heard many people say that the tenere and the dot, the lengthening dot, are both invented by Salem. The Vatican was so impressed with what Salem did that they put the monks in charge of revising all the chant books. The early 20th century saw a huge surge in interest in Gregorian chant as the Vatican pushed forth both the new editions from Salem and urged churches and seminaries to educate their people in chant. This was part of the liturgical movement, an effort to make sure that people knew, cared about, and understand liturgy in all its riches. Things changed dramatically once again in the 1960s. The Second Vatican Council called both for the creation of a revised order of Mass as well as for the Mass to be available in the vernacular. The Mass that emerged, which did not come from Vatican II but rather several years after, dramatically altered several things directly associated with chant. Most notably, the church calendar was completely rearranged, so the cycle of propers which had existed, at least in name, for well over 1,000 years, was dramatically upended. The texts of the ordinary remained the same in Latin, but it became commonplace to sing the ordinary in the vernacular rather than in Latin, so the ordinary chants, such as the Missa de Angelis, many of which were quite popular, also went into disuse. The divine office had been in constant upheaval since the Middle Ages, but it was rearranged and shortened too, and the most dramatic change it saw, musically, was the insertion of several non-Catholic hymns into its repertoire, rather than the medieval hymns, Latin hymns that had always been sung. that celebrated and promoted Gregorian chant, but as we see, had the unintended consequences of making chant unusable. The Fathers of Vatican II never had any intention of abolishing either Gregorian chant or Latin. They explicitly say so in both documents of the Council and the documents that followed. However, for 30 or 40 years after the Council, Gregorian chant effectively went extinct. The Old Tridentine Mass was not celebrated between 1970 and 1984, and after 1984 only by the bishop's approval until 2007. Chant was associated with this Old Mass, and not associated at all with the post-Vatican II Mass, disparagingly called by some the Novus Ordo, or New Order. However, there was no reason not to have chant at the New Order of Mass. After all, Latin remained the official language of the Church. Meanwhile, the monks of Salem continued to do what they always do. In 1974, they produced yet another book of the cycle of propers, but rearranged and edited to fit the new lectionary and church calendar. The official Vatican chants of the ordinary remained approved as they had since the early 1900s. However, the prevailing notion of these days in the 70s was that such things were no longer allowed, even though they were. Ironically, what brought Gregorian chant back into public consciousness was largely due to the secular music publishing scene. In the 1990s, several hugely popular CDs were released of Gregorian chant. Some of them were recordings of monks, and some of them were of secular groups. However, the people in the pews realized that they had a deep and ancient repertory of music that was disappearing, and began to clamor for it to return to the Mass rather than to the concert hall or the CD. In the Catholic Church today, more and more priests, bishops, and lay people recognize that Gregorian chant is authentic Catholic music and have been using it at Mass. This isn't to snuff out or extinguish other forms of Catholic music which have developed over the centuries, such as Polyphony, but rather to preserve the first form of music and make sure it doesn't disappear. In the last 15 years, many brave American composers have undertaken a new initiative, providing settings of the propers of the Mass in the vernacular. Since Vatican II, we have had vernacular translations of the ordinary with a whole host of musical settings, but the propers, which were only in Latin, largely disappeared. Recognizing that these texts should be said or sung at Mass where they belong, composers sought the English translations of the texts that Salem published in 1974. Some composers, such as the monk Father Samuel Weber, produced editions that very closely mirrored the chant melodies and are quite elaborate. I've been using Weber's settings since March in the English Masses. Others, such as Adam Bartlett, composed simpler melodies but which still use Salem chant square note notation, so as to teach amateur choirs and congregations how to read them. Still others, such as Richard Rice, have composed simple multi-part formulas not based on chant at all, so that choirs can sing in harmony. And just in the past 2 years, Janet Gorbitz has begun to produce a complete cycle of propers in Spanish, which I've been using since March. That means that St. Rose is one of the first Catholic churches in the entire country to use Spanish propers. How cool is that? Our last presentation, which will come next, is going to be a discussion of how chant applies to us today at St. Rose and how much we're supposed to use it.